Tears of the Kingdom resolves the Zelda timeline. Now, what does that mean? It's my belief that with the events in this game, the Zelda team are providing us with just enough clues to put to rest certain speculations that we've had about the Zelda series, so that future entries can move forward unburdened by this strange document. If Breath of the Wild was meant to push us away from the timeline, Tears of the Kingdom turns around, sorts a few things out, and gives the timeline a fond farewell as it looks forward to the coming horizon. But how can I make such a claim? How can I claim to have solved the infamous Zelda timeline? Well, to answer that, I need to explain what I mean when I talk about the Zelda timeline. Hyrule has no history. It isn't real, and it never will be, as much as it pains me to admit it. The games are games, the stories are tertiary, and the stories between stories are infinitely undeterminable. However, the development of the Zelda series does have a history. It's made by people, and people act and operate with intention. There's always been a timeline that connects the games, and I'm interested in what the developers thought they were doing when they made them. What was the intended story, even if the final result looks nothing like it? In order to fully understand this, it's best to break down the entire franchise entry by entry to see why exactly the timeline turned out the way it did, and where exactly Tears of the Kingdom fits into all of that. But I'm not going to make you sit through the whole video without telling you the theory, because that would be rude. Where do I think the memories in Tears of the Kingdom fall on the Zelda timeline? In my interpretation, these scenes where Zelda's sent back to the early days of Hyrule are clearly meant to take place in the era of Ocarina of Time, specifically in the Downfall timeline, where Zelda's time-traveling interference prevents the events of Ocarina from ever happening in the first place. It's just going to take a minute before we get there. Let's get started. Zelda 1. Ganon is a big pig who causes chaos and kidnaps Zelda with the help of the Triforce of Power. Link picks up a sword, collects the pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom, and beats him dead. Bing bang boom, we got ourselves a video game here. No timeline discrepancies as of yet. Zelda 2. Ganon is dead. His minions want to use Link's blood to revive him. Okay, so this is a sequel, plain and simple. Also, there's another Princess Zelda who was asleep for 100-some years, and we need to collect the pieces of the third secret piece of the Triforce in order to revive her. So 2 Zeldas, 3 Triforces, okay, sure, simple enough. We got ourselves a game, and we got ourselves a sequel. Zelda 3! We're going fast. A Link to the Past. Well, what does that title mean? Between the game and some supplemental materials, we get some backstory telling us that Ganon was originally a man named Ganondorf Dragmire. He led a gang of thieves into the Golden Land to claim the Triforce and use its powers to conquer Hyrule. He starts doing nasty stuff with it and is met with resistance by the Knights of Hyrule, led by 6 wise men or sages, depending on the translation, and in response to his rise of power, the people of Hyrule form a sacred blade called the Master Sword that would defeat Ganon, but before they could find someone to wield the blade, though, the conflict escalated and the 6 sages had to seal Ganon away in the Sacred Realm, leaving him to fester for generations, which resulted in that place becoming the Dark World, a twisted reflection of the surface, and this was known as the Imprisoning War. Interesting stuff. Maybe we'll come back to that sometime. Ganon escapes. Disguised as the mysterious wizard Aghanim, Ganon takes over Hyrule, and you gotta collect stones and maidens if you want to stop him. And then you do. Cool. When you win, you get to use the Triforce to put everything back to the way it was. Happy ending. So where does this fall in the timeline? Well, because it gives Ganon a new backstory and indicates that this is the first time he's escaped since absorbing the Triforce's power and becoming a pig beast, it's fair to assume this is a prequel. Also, it's called A Link to the Past. This is all deeply intuitive. So we got a game, a sequel, and a prequel. This also implies that there are different Links who rise up to fight evil in different time periods. This wouldn't be the same Link as the original game, right? I mean, they're all just kids, so we're already seeing this recursive theme in this world. There's also another Zelda, but now this is the 3rd Zelda, so we're used to that by now. Zelda 4, Link's Awakening. This one is pretty self-contained. Link goes on an island expedition to wake up a sleeping whale and de-res all his new friends. The only real clue we get to where this would fall in a timeline is that this Link already knows a Zelda, he calls out to her by name, and he already has a sword and shield. So it's fair to say that this is a Link who's already gone on an adventure or is in the midst of one unrelated to his current island shenanigans. Alright, so this one could probably go anywhere after Link to the Past. We also see, during the last boss fight, shadows of bosses from Link to the Past. Spoilers! One of them is also a shadow form of Ganon, so it's pretty fair to assume that this would be Link to the Past Link going on another adventure, and eventually that would be confirmed to be true. Alright then, Zelda 5, Ocarina of Time. This one This is going to take a little more time to explain. First off, before the game begins, there's this conflict called the Hyrulean Civil War. We don't know much about it, but we do know one consequence of it is that it kills the parents of a little boy named Link. The dying mother leaves baby Link at the mouth of the Kokiri Forest before she passes on, where he is raised by a tree and eventually sent off on an adventure to save the Kingdom of Hyrule. After leaving the forest, little boy Link makes his way to Hyrule Castle and meets little girl Zelda peeking in through a window as she watches a diplomatic meeting between her father, the Hylian King, and Ganondorf, the King of the Gerudo. Okay, so now we're actually getting to see Ganondorf as a man. Immediately, we can make the assumption that this is a prequel, and it turns out it is. So far, Ganon has been a pretty good measuring stick to determine where a game falls on the timeline. Is he alive? Is he dead? Is he a guy? Is he a pig? These are all good questions to ask if we want to know where and when we are. We also get some lore on Ganondorf. So, he's a member of the Gerudo, a tribe of people who are all women, with the exception that every 100 years, a new male is born into the tribe. In accordance with tradition, that male is made to be their king. He also has a pair of surrogate moms, Katake and Kawume, who are little green witches on brooms. They're great. Zelda confides in you that she doesn't trust Ganondorf. She thinks he's up to no good. It's a good thing he is, or Zelda would come across as pretty explicitly racist. We see Ganondorf taking a knee to offer fealty to the King of Hyrule when he notices the sound of children talking bad about him. Link and Zelda duck away and start to make a plan to take him down, which involves you doing all the work. You do some dungeons, you come back to Hyrule Castletown only to see Ganondorf chasing Zelda and her assistant Impa out of the city on horseback. For context, Impa is the last of the Sheikah, a race of people that serve the royal family of Hyrule, and she's like Zelda's personal assistant. Ganondorf's too big and strong to take down right now, so you bring the 3 sacred stones to the Temple of Time, where along with the Ocarina of Time, which you get from Princess Zelda, you open the Door of Time to the resting place of the Master Sword. Hold on. Wasn't the Master Sword made in response to Ganondorf rising to power? But maybe that's not in the game. But that was material that we were provided with. He hasn't risen to power yet. I mean, I guess he's caused some trouble for like the Deku Tree and Jabba Jabu, but he hasn't gotten the Triforce yet, which is why the sword would have been made. But also, if the sword was just made in response to that, then it would be brand new, which is definitely not what they're going for. Anyway, you pull the sword from the stone, which opens the gate to the Sacred Realm, but Ganondorf was right behind you and sneaks in to steal the Triforce and take over Hyrule. So that means the sword was definitely made before Ganondorf had inherited the power of the Triforce. Okay, so what we've come across is perhaps the first of a long line of very minor retcons. The Master Sword is the Blade of Evil's Bane. It's an ancient weapon with the power of the gods, but in its original incarnation in Link to the Past, it was made as a direct response to Ganon acquiring the Triforce for the first time. These two stories don't line up. But you know what? We're gonna move on for now. 7 years pass. It turns out you were too small to wield the Master Sword, so it put you in stasis until you were big enough. When you wake up in the Sacred Realm, you meet Rauru, an ancient sage of light who helped build the Temple of Time in which the Master Sword rested. Interesting. He's a hefty Hylian guy with a white mustache, and he tells you to go collect medallions and bring together more sages so they can help you take on Ganondorf, who's filled the world with monsters and ruined everything. So you do that. You play the game. You jump between the past and future, you complete 5 more dungeons to unite the remaining sages, Saria, Darunia, Ruto, Impa, and Nabooru, all of whom you have some prior relationship with before they're revealed to be sages. All except for Rauru. Of all the characters in that game, Raru's kind of an odd man out. He has official concept art and he's depicted as like the leader of the sages, but nothing else is really revealed about him. Another thing about him before we move on is that it would be confirmed after the fact that he is directly connected to Kaepora Gaebora, an owl who acts as a tutorial figure early in the game. Whether the owl is like an aspect of Rauru or a transformation, it's not clear, but the two are connected. So I guess that's a connection we had with this character before he was revealed to be a sage, but at that point, why not just have him be the owl? Why is he a guy? We'll come back to this. At this point, it may also be pertinent to point out how the Zelda series has been reincorporating ideas and motifs between entries so far. Kaepora Gaebora is an owl who guides you early in the game. This is taken directly from Link's Awakening, which also features an owl that gives you guidance. That game also features Marin and Terran as central characters, which would go on to inspire Malon and Talon of the now iconic Lon Lon Ranch. The use of past and future Hyrule is a direct parallel to the Light and Dark worlds in Link to the Past. The name of many characters and races are taken from unrelated stuff from previous entries, with Mido, Ruto, Saria, and Rauru all being characters whose names are shared with towns in Zelda 2. In canon, those towns will be named after these characters, but in reality the opposite is true. Impa's already a name that we've seen in previous entries and goes on to become synonymous with the name of Zelda's attendant in any time period, and we all know that there are many Links and many Zeldas. These recurring elements give the series an identity. Even though almost every game features a new time period and a new set of characters, by tying names, visuals, mechanics, and themes to previous entries, the series creates this sense of internal logic that makes it feel like you're coming home every time you boot up a new game. Here's a question. Why does almost every game take place in its own time period? Like, we're only 5 entries in, and they've already taken place across at least 3 different eras. The easy answer is, they're video games, it doesn't matter. If they want to reset the gameplay loop in each game in a way that minimizes the need for context or exposition, just have each entry set Link back to 0. This is the first adventure he's had against the forces of evil, no matter how many games you've already played. He collects items and hearts and gets stronger and saves the day. Hell, Zelda 2 has you just collecting Triforce pieces the same as Zelda 1. They just invented a brand new Triforce to justify it. These are games first, the stories don't matter, but hold on. Why did they need to make a new Triforce to justify collecting Triforce pieces in Zelda 2? Why is Ganon actually dead in Zelda 2? Why do they bother with continuity, with setting up lore and explaining things if these are just video games, if the story is so secondary? If Mario can just fight Bowser any number of times, why can't Link just fight Ganon the same way? Does the gameplay really necessitate justification? No. It's true that when developing these games, the story comes after the gameplay. We know that for a fact. They've told us this. But the story is still developed. There is still intent there. They do want The Legend of Zelda to be a series that has a narrative to it. They have ambitions in that respect. So then, what about that Master Sword retcon I mentioned earlier? If the games are supposed to have continuity, why are they already breaking their own established lore? Well, as unsatisfying as it might be, I think the ultimate answer is, some of the story matters and some of it just doesn't. There are pieces of interconnected storytelling that the developers are interested in executing, and other factoids and lore bits that they just change their mind on, or they might even just forget about. In Link to the Past, it was more narratively compelling for the Master Sword to be made specifically to defeat Ganon. When you get it for the first time, it feels like, finally, you've got the one weapon to take down this beast. And now that they're past that specific game, they want to have an acquire the Master Sword sequence, but they're telling the story of how Ganondorf originally rose to power. And they also want to use the Master Sword as a mechanic, as this key that allows you to teleport back and forth in time, so fuck it. The Master Sword's already there. It's fine. Who was complaining about this in the 90s? Nobody. Nobody cared. It was cool, and the lore is not more important than the fact that it was cool. What exactly am I getting at? Simply this. With each new entry, the developers focus on what makes sense for the game they're making. There's an understood sense of continuity between entries and recursive elements that tie the series together. However, if it's more compelling to recontextualize or change something established in the lore to better fit the game it's being written for, that will take priority every time. So, let's just keep that in mind because things are about to get so much messier. First, let's finish off Ocarina. After you beat the temples and reunite the sages, they make a rainbow bridge so you can enter Ganondorf's castle to confront him. You do that, and you win. After you beat Ganondorf, he absorbs his Triforce and reforms into Ganon, the Big Pig. You beat him, and it's specifically shown that you imprison him in the Sacred Realm. As he toilets away, he swears he'll be back to challenge you again and blah-de-blah. Hey, what do you know? This game was the imprisoning war the whole time. It directly leads into the backstory of A Link to the Past, with Ganon being sealed in the Sacred Realm thanks, in some small part, to the 6 sages. It all kinda lines up, even if some of the details have been changed. After this, Zelda feels bad that you gave up your childhood to save the world, so she decides to send you back. Back to before you ever traveled through time, so you can experience growing up the old-fashioned way. In a flash, Link is transported back to the Temple of Time, now a child again. Navi, our fairy companion, flies off without a word. Supposedly, her job is done. We then see a scene where all the people of Hyrule are celebrating the defeat of Ganon. We spent some time focusing on Mido and King Zora, away from the celebration, supposedly mourning the loss of their loved ones. Then we cut to the 6 sages on a mountaintop looking over the event. They are separate from the rest. Quick aside, are the sages dead? That's been a topic of speculation for the Zelda community for a while, but they're definitely beyond the realm of the living, at least. That's what these scenes are telling us, right? And, we see Darunia go off to face Volvagia without the hammer. Next time we see him, he's a sage. We're like, whoa, you did it, kid. Are they all dead? It feels like the game is leading us to that conclusion. They're at least some kind of spirit. They are no longer mortal flesh, but divine energy. And if that's true, then Rauru would be dead too, right? I'm just asking for later. He probably is. That's interesting stuff right there. So then, we see the final scene over the credits of Ocarina of Time of Link walking into the palace garden to meet Princess Zelda for the first time once again. End of game. Great game. Good job, everybody. Beautiful, beautiful image to go out on. So, so the timeline split. So if we're interpreting the events of the credit sequence, then there is a world where Ganon did rule and was defeated, leading to the people celebrating his defeat. There's also a world where Link goes back in time to meet Zelda again for the very first time, clearly implying that they're going to do things differently so that this bad future never comes to pass. So then the people celebrating would have no reason to do that. They wouldn't exist in that time, but they do. We see them celebrating. So that would be two contradictory timelines. And now we know that. We know there's two timelines at the end of Ocarina, but did they know that when they were making the game? Was that something the developers did on purpose? Maybe, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe when they were designing the end credits, they thought these scenes, the people celebrating and Link and Zelda re-meeting, were both important enough to include, and didn't really think about the implication of them both directly contradicting one another. Whether or not they intended Ocarina to have two different endings, that's definitely going to impact the games going forward. And before we jump into the next main set of games, Oracle of Ages and Seasons were released for the Game Boy. Hey, they were developed by Capcom, and they feature elements from Ocarina of Time and other entries in the franchise. Each takes place in its own kingdom and has its own magic MacGuffins, but if you beat both of them, you can put in a code to unlock the final battle with Ganon, summoned by Kotake and Kawume. Uh-oh, retcon, they were killed and specifically went to Christian heaven in Ocarina of Time, so this can't be a sequel, but it features a reincarnated Ganon, so it can't be a prequel. And you know what? It doesn't matter. They come after Link to the Past, it's cool. They were made by a different studio, the details don't matter too much, just toss them in there, it's fine. It's fine. So after Ocarina of Time was a big success, Aonuma and the Zelda team were tormented and cursed by the Demon King Miyamoto to release another game within a year, Majora's Mask. It's great, it's haunting, it's wild. It reuses a lot of assets from Ocarina and recontextualizes a lot of familiar characters, but maybe there's a reason for that. The game starts with Link, now a child again, leaving for the Lost Woods to find his fairy companion Navi, who, as we said, left him after the last adventure. Before he goes, Zelda gives him the Ocarina of Time. He winds up in a wacky world of terrible, terrible problems. So this is a sequel to Ocarina. Easy. Same Link, same Zelda, different world, maybe it's an illusion. This is like Link's Awakening, a self-contained adventure separate from everything else. But it specifically shows that after Ocarina of Time, Link is still a little boy. Okay, so getting sent back in time stuck. I guess that would mean that in one timeline, Ganon is defeated, leading into Link to the Past and the rest of those games, and the other timeline leads to Majora's Mask. Okay, I see what they're doing here. They made it so Ocarina is both a prequel to the older games with a sort of adult timeline, and also leads into a whole new batch of games that will follow Majora's Mask in this, let's call it the child timeline. Since Ocarina was such a pivot point for the series, it would make sense that they would make this divide here. Zelda is going to have a new direction going forward, and that's narratively justified in two endings. Smart planning. So now I guess we can expect to see that the next game is a direct sequel to Majora's Mask. Maybe Link grows up again, and he faces a brand new evil in a new kingdom, or goes back to Hyrule. Wind Waker! The next big game is Wind Waker! In ancient times, a hero clad in green arose to defeat the evil King Ganondorf. After conquering the monster, the hero left this world, and the people entered an age of peace. Slowly over time, the demon returned and wreaked havoc on the world once more, and the people expected the hero to come back and rise up against the darkness, but he never did. Desperate, the people turned to the gods who flooded the world to contain Ganondorf's vile wickedness. Now, the people live on islands. One day, some kid, no one special, gets roped into a rescue effort to get his sister back from a big bird. This leads him into a wild adventure, where he must re-enter the sunken kingdom of Hyrule, reclaim the Master Sword, revitalize its magic powers, reform the Triforce of Courage, and save the world. So, the backstory to Wind Waker pretty explicitly follows the ending of Ocarina of Time. This is confirmed throughout the game. We even see the sages from Ocarina in stained glass in the resting place of the Master Sword, but hold on. That would mean that this is the adult timeline, where Ganon rose to power and the sages were awakened to stop him alongside the hero of time. So this is not a sequel to Majora's Mask. In the intro, when it describes the hero riding off and never returning, that's a depiction of Zelda sending Link away and out of that timeline. Whatever the spirit of the hero is that reincarnates every generation to stop evil, specifically Ganondorf, it left with that Link. It's explicitly said throughout the game that Wind Waker Link does not carry the same spirit of the hero present in Ocarina Link. He's just some kid who has to rise to the occasion. He's the kid who stepped up. This can also be seen in the way that while Ganondorf and Tetra have Triforce pieces embedded in them that respond to each other, Link has to collect the Triforce of Courage in everyone's favorite endgame adventure. It was shattered when Ocarina Link left that timeline. That's why no hero rose to defeat Ganon in the backstory when we returned, and that's why the gods had to flood the world. Okay. But then, if Link leaving the adult timeline removes the spirit of the hero, then the end of Ocarina can't also be a prequel to Link to the Past and the rest of the games that come after that. Because if it was, then there would be other heroes between Ocarina and Wind Waker, but the narrative indicates that there aren't. So I guess we don't know how Ocarina leads into Link to the Past. But hold on. I know what you're thinking. The split timeline is something they made up when they released the official timeline in 2010 or whatever. There was no plan. They were just releasing games and linking them together haphazardly after the fact. But I'm sorry to say, that's just not true. Before the release of Wind Waker, in 2002, there was an interview with Miyamoto and Aonuma in which Aonuma clearly states, Ocarina of Time basically has two endings of sorts. One has Link as a child, and the other has him as an adult. This game, The Wind Waker, takes place 100 years after the adult Link defeats Ganon at the end of Ocarina. Yes, so the timeline split was already being considered as early as Wind Waker. Also 100 years later? The world enters an age of peace, experiences a new hardship, is completely flooded, is rebuilt on disparate islands, and forgets most of its history within 100 years? Also in that time, the fish evolve into birds. This doesn't make a lot of sense, Aonuma, but you know what? Again, these details don't really matter. At the end of Wind Waker, you stab Ganondorf through the brain. He turns into stone, and then the ocean falls on him. It seems like he's really done for this time, but we all know he always comes back, right? Without that magic bubble, the original Hyrule is also officially sunk. Link and Tetra do survive and go on more adventures. So, cool. Next game, Twilight Princess. Oh shit, you turn into a wolf. This game has another Link facing off against Zant, the Twilight Menace. It's a great game with a bad opening, but where does it fall in the timeline? Well, before the events of the game, Ganondorf is arrested for treason. He's found guilty and is executed by a set of sages who are notably nothing like the sages in Ocarina of Time. I mean, every game has its own art style, but these guys are just some strange ghouls. The execution doesn't stick, however, and Ganon is imprisoned in the Twilight Realm, where he's able to trick Zant into becoming his disciple, which kicks off all the bad stuff. So wait, is this the Imprisoning War? No. Well, no. Again, the way the series reincorporates stuff turns every game into an endless Easter egg hunt if you are sufficiently deranged. So hold on, what is Ganondorf being imprisoned for? What did he do? Well, this game falls in the child timeline. It comes after Ocarina Link returns from the future and warns Zelda and the rest of the kingdom about Ganondorf's treachery. So instead of taking over Hyrule, he's sentenced to death and then the game happens. This also makes sense thematically, since Twilight Princess, more so than the other sequels to Ocarina, is very much retreading the format of that game. I mean, it's no secret that they wanted to really lean into nostalgia after Wind Waker turned some people off, so this game has Ganondorf basically pulling the same scheme he used in Ocarina, because technically he hasn't had a chance to do it yet. It all just kind of works, even if the details are getting increasingly muddy. We also know that the hero shade who teaches you stuff is Ocarina Link, and he's a Stalfos maybe because he died in the Lost Woods after Majora's Mask, I don't know. This all works. Why are there no Gerudo in the desert in this game? Well, they were probably banished for assisting in Ganondorf's coup. Also, the sages are different, because these are not the sages from Ocarina. Those people had no reason to rise to the occasion because Ganondorf never took over during their lifetimes. It also feeds into the idea that those sages were also dead or spirits or something, because these sages definitely are. Is that everything? That basically sums it up. I mean, at the end of the game, you stab Ganondorf's open chest wound, the Triforce of Power leaves him, his servant Zant snaps his neck from beyond the grave, and Ganondorf dies standing on his feet. It's a pretty definitive ending for the guy, but, you know, Ganondorf always comes back, or whatever. Midna turns into a full-grown woman, and everyone is like, what do I do with this information? And then the game's over. Go home. It's worth noting that Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess were all directed by Eiji Aonuma, who is broadly considered to be the head honcho when it comes to Zelda. He had direct control over where the games went with their gameplay and stories, so it makes sense that all three of these games show an equal understanding of how the timeline split works. And it's also worth noting that audiences at that time, especially Western audiences who likely had no access to developer interviews, had no reason to believe that the split timeline even exists, or that it worked to explain the disparate canons presented in the games. I mean, Wind Waker and Twilight Princess are specifically so diametrically opposed in every way, and they operate with such a different understanding of their predecessor. Given that they fall into separate timelines, the disparity kind of makes sense. But hey, let's throw any sense we have out the window. During this time, Capcom was making more Zelda games. Four Swords Adventures, and Minish Cap. These games feature the Four Sword, and are like a spin-off multiplayer dungeon crawler reimagining of the Zelda franchise, except for Minish Cap, which is more like a traditional Zelda game. They don't follow any kind of canon or timeline, and are largely self-contained. They even have their own recurring villain called Vati, the Wind Mage. Through the reuse of imagery and iconography, we can see that Four Sword Adventure is a sequel to Four Swords, and Minish Cap is a prequel to both of them, exploring the origin of the Four Sword itself and the villain Vati. Oh hey, it's like Capcom did their own Zelda 1, 2, and Link to the Past. The first two games are kind of a broad pastiche of the entire Zelda franchise with imagery and characters from all across the series. Again, these games are being made by a different company with different goals in terms of how they present the franchise. Zelda stuff is cool. Throw in as much of it as you can in this new Zelda game. Four Swords Adventures even features Ganondorf. He's not the same Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time, which as far as we know was the only Ganondorf in the series up to this point. This Ganondorf actually is just a guy who touches a magic trident, which results in him becoming the big pig we all know and love. So that's, it's like throwing Ganon story stuff in a blender. But hey, these games are basically their own spin-off, and they're pretty fun. Plus, Minish Cap comes up with its own origin for Link's little hat, which is nice. I mean, the Kokiri already wore little green hats, so that could be seen as the origin, but maybe also Link wearing a hat is an homage to grumpy old Eslo. There were also two direct sequels to Wind Waker on the DS, Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks. Phantom Hourglass features the same Link and Tetra from Wind Waker looking for new horizons and running into trouble with Bellum, an evil squid man. Spirit Tracks takes place a generation or so later in a new land of Hyrule discovered by those crazy kids. It features a brand new enemy, Nat King Cole, also known as the Mad King Malladus, and Zelda dies, but she's alright. In the end, trains save the day. These games are a little hard to enjoy playing, but they got a lot of spunk. As far as the timeline's concerned, this makes the adult timeline a pretty straightforward, straight line with clear beginning and end, cause and effect relationships. But it does make me wonder about those older games, that we don't know what to do with them. If Ocarina Link defeating Ganon is not the impetus of the Imprisoning War, but instead leads into Wind Waker, and then the original Hyrule is destroyed after Wind Waker, then there's really no room for those games in the adult timeline. Are they after Twilight Princess? Is there another Imprisoning War after that game? What's going on here? Don't worry, the answer is here. Skyward Sword. Finally, we'll learn where it all started. Demise was a bad guy, and Hylia was a good guy. Hylia had the Triforce and sent all the people into the sky so she could fight Demise mano-a-mano. She seals, or imprisons, Demise, who became known as the Imprisoned. Link gets the call to action when Zelda falls down a hole. You go back and forth in time a little, prove yourself worthy to wield the Master Sword. That's right, this was the origin story of the Master Sword. You fill it with secret flames and do all kinds of tasks so you can keep proving yourself worthy. Then you summon the Triforce and wish for your own home to crash into the earth right on top of Demise's stupid head. You go back in time one more time to save Zelda and beat Demise mano-a-mano. It turns out that Demise, who's basically just the devil, is the reason Ganon and all the other bad boys keep coming back over and over again. It's his rage that fuels these nasty creeps. Also, Zelda has the blood of the goddess Hylia, which is why Zelda is so useful all the time. And Link, well, there's always a hero, so, this was the first hero. Maybe the second, I don't know. So, the Master Sword definitely wasn't made during the Imprisoning War. Or was it? It wasn't, but was this the Imprisoning War? No. Well, no. So Skyward Sword is the first game that really presents itself as this one is important for the lore. This is the origin of all these important artifacts and themes and all that stuff. Most games, when they present lore, do so within the context of how it affects the present story. But by positioning itself as the origin of everything, Skyward Sword is this attempt to unify the canon in a definitive way. A lot of people don't care for this game, myself included, but hey, I appreciate that part of the story is that Zelda traps herself at a physical giant crystal. The idea that that's something that's been happening to her since time immemorial is pretty funny. Also, now we have another origin for Link's hat, with the Knights Academy uniform. There's always a good reason to wear a sock on your head. And, Link Between Worlds is a game. Let's just toss this in. It's Link to the Past again. It's great. It's a sequel to that game. So, that's settled. As much as Skyward Sword asserted its placement at the beginning of the timeline, it doesn't really explain where other games fall in said timeline. Then they released the Zelda timeline. The Hyrule Historia is this big old document full of cool behind-the-scenes stuff. With it, we saw a complete timeline, one that featured every game in the series not made by Philips CDI or featuring a crossbow. And hold on, what is this? Why is Four Swords Adventure after Twilight Princess? Wait a second, the Decline of Hyrule. What is this third timeline? The hero is defeated? What do you mean? That's not how the timelines work. Now, the release of this document, as well as several others, are where we get a lot of the nitty-gritty details of intent and design philosophy and stuff, and it's also where a lot of people saw this split timeline idea for the first time. But it's not just 2 timelines. Now 3 timelines branch off from Ocarina. 2 are made from the event of Zelda sending Link back in time at the end of the game, and the third appears to be a what-if scenario in the off chance that Link just fails to defeat Ganondorf? Maybe he gets eaten by a Octorok, I don't know. So, people were a little miffed about this at the time, and they continue to be miffed about it. For some people, they really would just prefer to not think about this timeline at all, and see it as a clumsy back-end way to tie together lore that isn't important. It's called The Legend of Zelda, after all, so aren't they all just legends? Yeah, sure. Still others will note the fact that the Hyrule Historia, despite being an officially released product in conjunction with Nintendo, isn't necessarily canonical. Some things don't add up. There are in fact retcons, like we've already covered, but there's even more now. And besides, they basically admitted that the timeline is subject to change in the future, so why bother referring to it at all? Maybe the timeline is just, whatever. It doesn't matter, everyone can just make their own if they want. All those points are fair. And reasonable. However, to default to that point of view is to ignore a very interesting fact. They released this timeline. This is a product they presented us with, and it's weird. It's not especially intuitive. Why make the old games a whole new timeline? Why include the Four Swords games at all? And why on earth is Four Swords Adventure so far away from the others? What is it doing at the end of the child timeline? They updated the timeline at one point too. They moved Link's Awakening ahead of the Oracle games. Why? No one was asking about that. It's like the least interesting change they could possibly make. What's going on here? Will we ever know? Oh, fuck it. Breath of the Wild. After Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild was a breath of fresh air. Open terrain, freedom of movement, non-linear gameplay, and storytelling. Also, fuck the timeline. It doesn't matter anymore. The game makes frequent reference to games from all parts of the timeline. So where does it fall in the timeline? At the end. At the far end. So far that according to official sources, the other 3 timelines just kind of glom together into Breath of the Wild eventually. It's like they don't even care about this dumb timeline that they just released a few years earlier. Why would they do this? Well, in terms of franchise management, it does make a lot of sense. Breath of the Wild, like Ocarina of Time, was a turning point for the series. Many staples were being thrown out. The core player experience was being placed front and center, with most of the storytelling being silently communicated through set dressing. There is no history to Hyrule. Let the past die, kill it if you have to. Everyone gets to play in the sandbox now. And let's be honest, this has been a lot of words so far to say that the mix of looseness, reincorporation, and bizarre choices in the Zelda chronology has made following this interconnected narrative of the series more of a physical challenge than a reward for dedicated fans. They were never going to tell a single story that tied each entry together, so why keep up the facade? Also, Breath of the Wild was the hot new game on the hot new console. And also on Wii U. Let the internal story speak for itself with questionably directed voice acting. Now we can move forward with an actual planned story. Like it or not, Breath of the Wild is here to stay. It's what the Zelda franchise is all about now. Alright, what happens in the game? So, there's a bunch of calamities over time. Ganon's back. He takes over a bunch of robots. He's the biggest pig he's ever been. Zelda seals him away. Link wakes up 100 years later after getting bopped on the noggin, and he's got to go reconnect with a whole world devastated by Ganon's wrath. It's all pretty straightforward. There's some weird architecture that kind of looks Aztec-inspired. You win the day, you save Zelda, everything works out. 7 years pass. Well, 6, but, parallels. The Zelda team release a sequel to Breath of the Wild called Tears of the Kingdom. Okay, so where to begin? As far as the takes I've seen from people regarding Tears of the Kingdom that have gotten the most traction, a lot of people are thinking it's officially just retconning everything, or it's completely separating this modern era of Zelda from the series' history. Too many things are different. They're reusing familiar names, but they mean different things now. What are we supposed to think about this stuff? I've even seen people say, oh, well, this is clearly set before Skyward Sword, so now Demise is an incarnation of Calamity Ganon instead of the other way around, and the Imprisoning War is the imprisonment of the imprisoned. So that's a retcon too, and no, it isn't quite, but I can see the confusion. So, let me defend myself. I think that the flashbacks take place around the era of Ocarina of Time in the Downfall timeline. And I do not think this game is attempting to rewrite everything or decanonize everything, but it's been enough setup. Let's get to the meat of things. First, let's just break down how the game starts. So I boot up the game, and Zelda goes, "This was the Imprisoning War," and a little light flicks on in the back of my head where I'm like, I think I know what that is. I recognize that name. Then we meet Mummy Ganon, and he's like, "Rauru put his faith in you," and another light flicks on, and I was like, okay. So that's the Sage of Light from Ocarina of Time. Why, of all people, would you evoke that guy's name as a nostalgia reference, or what is this? Then some stuff happens, Zelda goes back to the past, and Link wakes up and sees a ghost goat man who's like, "Actually, I'm Rauru, and that's my hand. Don't do anything I wouldn't do." Okay, so this is Rauru now. He's changed, but why? Why would they use the name Rauru for this new character? I really want to emphasize, Rauru is so small in the pantheon of Zelda characters. He is a minor figure in one game. I've spent more time talking about him in this video than Ocarina of Time spends on him altogether. He's not an Impa, he's not a beetle, he's not a Tingle. What would prompt a person writing the game to make one of the main characters of the game a backdoor reference to such an obscure individual? You can even see in the new Rauru's design, he's got this little necklace. And that kind of looks like the old Rauru's design, but still, why? To what end? Anyway, Zelda goes back to the past and discovers that she's so far back that she's meeting the first king and queen of Hyrule, Rauru and Sonia. Okay, so now Rauru is a king. Also, I think this is what is really keeping people very hung up regarding when this is supposed to take place. If it's supposed to be the beginning of the whole kingdom, the first king and queen, then this has to be bringing us back to the age of Skyward Sword, right? Because this is the beginning of the timeline. I mean, even if we don't assume that the Link and Zelda from that game go on to become a king and queen, I mean, we do know that there's a kingdom in Minish Cap, which is before Ocarina in the timeline, so that would mean that this would either have to be before that game, or we would have to retcon that. We'll get back to this first king and queen thing in just a second. What else do the cutscenes show us? A few things happen, the characters talk about some stuff. They confirm that Zelda is their distant ancestor because she has both Sonia's time powers and Rauru's light powers. Minero shows up and she's like, "Oh man, the only way to get to the future is to become an immortal dragon, but that's forbidden, so there's no way that'll come up again in the story." Then we see a scene where Ganondorf is attacking the Hylians with a horde of Moldugas. In this scene, we see Rauru blast away the entire stampede of monsters with one beam of light. Specifically, we see both Sonia and Zelda give some vague amount of power to strengthen his attack. It also shows us that Zelda's power is distinctly stronger than Sonia's is. So supposedly, if Zelda was not there, Rauru's attack against the Moldugas would have been less effective. It may not have been able to take them all out in a single hit. That's what we are being led to believe. What this scene is showing us is that Zelda being there is contributing in some esoteric way to the war effort, whatever this war might be. She is helping to push back Ganondorf's assault, and Ganondorf determines that brute strength may not be enough. Then the next scene is a scene lifted directly from Ocarina of Time, where Ganondorf gets down on one knee to swear fealty to the Hylian king while plotting said king's demise. We even have this version of Zelda saying the same thing that baby Zelda said in Ocarina of Time. She doesn't trust him, she thinks he's evil. And Raru's like, yeah, I mean, that's politics. He's definitely evil. We just kind of gotta work with that. People are going to be evil in politics, Zelda. I don't know if you just got born yesterday. And then in a later scene, Ganondorf kills Raru's wife, the Queen Sonia, and steals her magic rock so he can become all-powerful. It's very sad. Everyone's super bummed about it. Raru runs in and he's so mad. He wants to fight Ganondorf right there, but Zelda tells him to back off, and then she gets them both out of there with her little purr-pad. So Zelda being there definitely had an effect on that scene, right? If she hadn't been there, Raru would have tried to face Ganondorf head-on in a one-on-one combat, right? Probably. And he would have died. He can't beat Ganondorf alone. He would have required a squad of sages to help him out. But because Zelda was there, Raru survived that encounter. He didn't die. So what am I getting at with all of this? Why am I convinced that this is all taking place in the era of Ocarina of Time in the Downfall timeline? I mean, this is one of the options we have before us. Why am I sticking to that? According to our current timeline, if Link fails to defeat Ganon during Ocarina, the sages are the only ones left who can seal him away rather than properly defeat him, and that's what leads into Link to the Past and the rest of those games. And it always felt a little bit like a cop-out. Like I was saying before, the big games released after Ocarina followed the logic of a world divided between timelines. Obviously, the games that came before weren't made with that narrative in mind. So it just feels like in order to keep those games relevant to the lore without interfering with what they were doing with the new story, they just sequestered them off in what-if scenario where Link dies and everything gets nasty, but that just doesn't match the other timelines at all. It isn't operating off of the same mechanic. It's just odd. So what Tears of the Kingdom does is it provides a new explanation for this specific branch of the timeline. The Downfall timeline is a result of Zelda going back in time and rewriting history. So according to this theory, the land of Hyrule does not become a kingdom until Raru comes down from the heavens, meets Sonia, and the two agree to unite the land under a single flag. This attempt to unify the peoples into the Kingdom of Hyrule is what initiates the Hyrulean Civil War, the conflict that takes place just before Ocarina of Time. Ganondorf is reasonably upset by this bald-faced colonial invasion by the Zonai and fights back. Now this theory does institute a major retcon. How do we explain Minish Cap? Is it not the Kingdom of Hyrule that we save in that game? No, it's a smaller kingdom, one that could fit on a handheld device. I mean, the landmarks were always different, Mount Krenel instead of Death Mountain. But they probably do refer to it as Hyrule at some point in the game. So, yes, I am presenting the idea that we retcon that. The Minish Cap is taking place in a smaller kingdom that is not the Kingdom of Hyrule. Keep in mind, there have been larger retcons present since the 90s, so as far as retcons go, this one is pretty insignificant. The land of Hyrule was not considered a kingdom until the era of Ocarina of Time. And the main reason I'm accepting this retcon is because the alternative is to retcon the whole backstory of Ganondorf. Ganondorf has always come from this time period. He was a man. He led the Gerudo as a regular king, and then in Ocarina of Time, he gains the ability to channel the power of the demon Big Pig. Of all the things to retcon, completely retconning Ganon's backstory would be very strange. Every appearance of Ganondorf, he's been the same guy with the same backstory. Except, of course, for Four Swords Adventures, where there's literally just a new guy named Ganondorf. I mean, Four Swords Adventures is maybe the game that is the least cohesive with any kind of unified timeline. But naturally, we would be led to believe this is not that Ganondorf. This is the Ganondorf we've known from every other game. And again, Ganondorf has, since the beginning of the series, served as a divining rod to determine where we are in time. Alive, dead, man, pig, these are things to keep in mind. In Tears of the Kingdom, this is a retelling of his familiar backstory, and it aligns with Ocarina really well. Again, we see a scene that is identical to one from that game. But here's the difference. This Ganondorf does not know a Link. There is no Link equivalent in any of these cutscenes. If this is Ocarina of Time, why aren't the sages helping the hero of time? And why is Ganon's power coming from this secret stone, instead of from the Triforce after he followed Link into the Secret Realm? So, my theory is, if the battle that Zelda contributed to against the Moldugas was part of the Hyrulean Civil War, then Zelda's influence could have brought that war to a premature end. Perhaps even some of the victims of this war would have survived and not left their child in the hands of a tree. Link had a happy childhood in this timeline, and the happier Link's childhood is, as we all know, the worse off the world becomes. He never gets the call to action and doesn't take on the quest to open the way to the Master Sword and the Sacred Realm. Again, this is speculation, but it all kind of just lines up perfectly. Zelda's influence threw off the events leading into Ocarina of Time, so it never really happened. Instead, Ganondorf acquired a secret stone, became incredibly powerful, and only through the combined efforts of Zelda, Rauru, and the sages was he able to be temporarily restrained. This is the imprisoning war. But hold on. How can Ganon keep showing up in the Downfall timeline if Ganondorf is in stasis? Well, the same way that Calamity Ganon does. We know for a fact, almost for a fact, that Calamity Ganon in Breath of the Wild is an aspect of this specific Ganondorf. So it would make sense that the multiple appearances of Ganon in the Downfall timeline are just that, a projection of Ganondorf's malicious will, escaping Rauru's seal while his true power is locked away. These could even be considered the multiple calamities that take place every 10,000 years in the Breath of the Wild backstory. Link to the Past, Zelda 1, the one from the mural, the one in Breath of the Wild. That would be 4 calamities over 40,000 years. Ganon's other appearances in that timeline involve him being summoned, so they wouldn't operate off that same timescale. Also, the scene where Ganondorf kills Sonia and takes her magic stone. So we've already talked about this. If Zelda wasn't there, he would have killed Rauru too, right? Now we know Rauru and Sonia had to have had a kid before Sonia died because Zelda is their descendant. What do you think their kid's name was? It was probably Zelda, wasn't it? That seems to be the way things go. Where did the kid go after Sonia died? She was taken by her attendant, Impa, the last of the Sheikah during those days. They rode off on horseback to protect the young princess. And in the timelines where Link actually got to go on his adventure, Link catches them just as they're escaping Castletown, and Zelda throws them the titular Ocarina of Time. Interesting, an artifact that's specifically linked to time powers. Then Ganondorf rides up, and he blasts Link with a power he did not exhibit before, almost as if he has a new source of strength, a magic rock of sorts. Then he chases after the princess, doesn't locate her, she goes into hiding with Impa. This scene from Ocarina of Time would have taken place directly after the scene where Ganondorf kills Queen Sonia and King Rauru, because yes, in addition to being an ancient sage, the Rauru we knew in Ocarina of Time was Zelda's father. He was the king of Hyrule. He died trying to avenge his wife. His spirit found its way to the Temple of Time, where he wore the mantle of sagehood and guided Link toward his next mission. But hold on. Rauru isn't the king in Ocarina of Time. He's a guy. He's an ancient sage. He's an owl. Well, I got a question for you. What do the kings look like in the Zelda world? Without fail, they're hefty guys with white facial hair. They all have that Santa aesthetic. You know, like Rauru. It's interesting that all future kings look like him. But hey, you could say this design choice doesn't confirm anything. After all, the white-haired old man design is also used for the role of guidance characters in older games. The old man who says it's dangerous to go alone, take this, has that same basic look. Sure, and in Breath of the Wild, the role of that old man was taken up by the spirit of the King of Hyrule. But would a king be presenting himself as an owl to help some ragamuffin kid? Seems a little beneath the office, right? I don't know, but I guess he would present as a boat if the situation demanded it. Also, Zelda's dad in Skyward Sword is designed to look very similar to Rauru with the same color robes and everything. If Zelda's dad is like Rauru, then Rauru is like Zelda's dad, and in Ocarina of Time that would have made him the king. I'm just saying. I'm seeing connections here. There's something here, and I think I've got it. That's why they named the first king of Hyrule Rauru in Tears of the Kingdom. He could have been named anything else, but they called the guy Rauru. Okay, so if this is supposed to be an interpretation of that same character of Rauru from Ocarina of Time, why do the two designs look completely different? I mean, it's a bit of a lame answer, but I think the answer is they just don't have any interest in that old design. We know the Zonai were already conceived and potentially designed by the time Breath of the Wild was released, because the game directly and indirectly references them, so whether or not they had any narrative plan for the Zonai back then, it's up in the air. But given the significant development time for each of these games, I have to imagine the writers and artists working on both had a lot of time to create content that informs the game world without actually being featured in the game. My guess is they just liked the designs they'd made up for the Zonai and stuck with it. They left a little homage to the old design with the necklace. I mean, they did the same thing with the Rito in Breath of the Wild. Previously, they were just people with bills, but now they're fully fledged bird people. Why is the design so different? I mean, it's Zelda, baby! Design aesthetics change every game! Oh, and in case you're wondering how a Rito could appear as a sage if this is in the Ocarina of Time downfall era when they supposedly came to exist in the adult timeline, they already retconned that. In a texture on a wall in Twilight Princess HD, a game that came out while Breath of the Wild was being developed, there is a mural of a big Birdman. This is a game that should not feature the Ritos at all. I think the reason it was included was so that developers could just say, hey, if you're worried about stuff not matching up, it's fine. We're going forward with Ritos from now on. They're just here now. We like Ritos. And with that same mindset, there very well could have been Rito back in Ocarina of Time. But we never went north the Gerudo Desert to check out their icy mountain home, you know? Oh, also, this theory would explain why in Tears of the Kingdom there is no Sheikah sage. That's weird, right? We have a Rito, a Goron, a Zora, a Gerudo, Zelda the Hylian, and 2 Zonai. When the game said go to Kakariko to find out about the floating rings, I was like, oh, is Purah going to be the new Sage of Spirit? No, it's a robotic goat ghost. Why would the Sheikah be excluded? Well, in Ocarina of Time, Impa was the last of the Sheikah, and she's off protecting the young princess in hiding. So there are no Sheikah to take up the mantle. Now let's take a step back. I think this is a pretty effective interpretation of the material. Between the character names and events, the scenes we see, and the way things play out, I think it's fair to propose that the flashbacks in Tears of the Kingdom depict Zelda transported back to the time just before Ocarina of Time, just before the Hyrulean Civil War. While she's there, she impacts the direction of the war, changing history, preventing the Link from that era from taking on the role of the hero. Then the events follow closely with how things do transpire in Ocarina of Time, with the notable absence of a youth from the forest acquiring sacred stones to open the Temple of Time. Ganondorf kills Sonia to acquire her secret stone and is prepared to kill Rauru, but Zelda's there, she gets him out of there. Ganondorf leads an army of darkness as Rauru plans to unite the people once more to face him through the power of the Zonai's secret stones. Perhaps, while it is unstated in the text, Ganondorf is attempting to use his new power to reach that fabled sacred realm where the Triforce still sleeps, since there's no boy to follow into it this time. Maybe that's where the sages' final battle takes place, at the precipice of the Golden Lands. It's their last chance to prevent an eternity of darkness. You know what's wild? In the scene of Ganondorf taking a knee, the recreation of the scene from Ocarina of Time, this theory would also explain why Ganondorf doesn't look off toward the window in this version the way he did in the original. You know why? Because Zelda doesn't have a forest boy to loudly whisper plans to. She's just there, alone, worried, but with no one to commiserate with. It's like it all makes sense. Everything just works. Now, this is all well and good, but I'm not going to pretend there aren't some other retcons that come with this interpretation beyond the Minish Cap thing. For instance, Ganondorf should not have a rock in his head the first time we see him in Ocarina of Time. He got that later. Why doesn't his character model change? Also, the Sage of Shadow is now the Sage of Lightning to match with the whole, the Gerudo are associated with that power. Is that because Ganon uses lightning in some of his attacks? Was that the logic in making, the Gerudo have lightning powers as part of their elemental chemistry system in Breath of the Wild? We also have to wonder if these are the same sages that we see in Ocarina of Time. They might be, but maybe not. They're wearing masks, so there's really no way of knowing unless that shows up in the DLC. It's pretty well confirmed that Totk and Kuume are the 2 regular Gerudo women who flank Ganondorf in a couple of scenes, and they're not little green witches on brooms, but I think that's just another design change. I'd prefer they be little green witches on brooms, but it seems that doesn't match their current aesthetic that they're going for, and I think that's a shame. Oh, also, this resolves the retcon of Totk and Kuume being involved in the Oracle games, because Link doesn't beat them in the Downfall timeline, so that's why they're just hanging out and summoning Ganon. When you think about it, this means this is the least unretcon timeline of all. Looking back at this video so far, I think there's a reason that they basically said Breath of the Wild is so far past the rest of the series that each timeline just leads into it. It's good branding. Breath of the Wild was a reboot of the series. It's also just, the template and canon they're going forward with. If they tie that into one timeline, that means fans of games from other timelines would be left in the lurch. And by removing the pressure to fit in the timeline, they're able to just be more free-form, have more creative exploration of what the franchise can be. Breath of the Wild completely changed the formula and the way the developers approach the game design. They even changed Link's shirt. It's not even green. That's crazy. Where's his little hat now, Eslo? So it would stand to reason that they wouldn't want to dig right back into that old timeline in the direct sequel and reposition the game to fit right into the Downfall timeline specifically. I mean, they wouldn't do that, would they? I get they wouldn't want to do that. It makes sense, but, really? Even if they are rewriting the canon to match however they want to tell the story going forward, there's so much here that is so layered with reference and allusion to things and names that we know that to say none of it actually connects to anything else is just strange. If they didn't want to evoke the older games, why aren't the ancient past memories set during the original calamity from the mural? That would keep this branch of the series self-contained, but they don't do that. It just makes perfect sense to me that this would be the downfall timeline. I mean, Breath of the Wild was always an homage to the original Zelda. It always felt like the spirit of the downfall timeline was most present in these games anyway. Plus, if Tears of the Kingdom was at the end of the downfall timeline, this would be the perfect way to finally finish off Ganondorf once and for all. Oh, did I not mention that part of the theory? We have now faced Ganondorf 4 times across the franchise. Sure, we've battled Ganon plenty of times, but we know that at least Calamity Ganon, if not every appearance of just Ganon, is a projection of a sealed Ganondorf. This is only the 4th time we have fought the Demon King in his original form, in his Gerudo form. The first, in Ocarina of Time, we do not kill Ganondorf. He is sealed in the Sacred Realm. This sets off the adult timeline. In the adult timeline, the spirit of the hero is sent away. Ganondorf rises back to power. The gods flood the world to stop his wickedness, but he persists. Covetous of the winds that graced the green fields of Hyrule, Ganondorf was tireless in his efforts to reclaim that kingdom under the waters. The hero of winds, the master of his own destiny, faces Ganondorf, and with the help of the Pirate Queen Tetra, he is able to get the better of the old fool, and lodges the Master Sword, the sword that seals the darkness, right through his friggin' skull. Ganondorf, defeated, turns to stone, and the ocean falls on him. Wind Waker has 2 direct sequels. Ganondorf plays no role in either of those sequels. Was Ganondorf truly defeated in this timeline? Can he even be defeated for good? Yes. How do I know? 4 Swords Adventures. That's right, baby. I cracked the fucking code. The next time we fight Ganondorf is in Twilight Princess. By a divine prank, Ganondorf was gifted the power of the gods, survived his own execution, and was banished to the Twilight Realm where he was akin to a god. Taking advantage of a desperate fool, Ganondorf regains his physical form and conquers the land of Hyrule in a pale, dark storm. The hero of Twilight rises to the challenge, and once again, with the help of both Princess Zelda and Princess Midna, Link is able to lodge the Master Sword in Ganondorf's open stab wound. The light of the Triforce of Power leaves his hand, his power over Zant is undone, and Ganondorf dies, standing on his feet. But is he really dead? Couldn't he return again to sow discord? No. You know why? 4 Swords Adventures! You may recall from earlier in this video that 4 Swords Adventures features a new Ganondorf. He's not the same Ganondorf as any other game. A new guy is born to the Gerudo and made their king. They named this guy Ganondorf. Great idea, guys! Why would this game, of all games, invent a new backstory for a guy named Ganondorf? Well, if we acknowledge the reality of the game's development, it was made by another company as a bit of a spin-off title. It's a broad pastiche of Zelda stuff, a loose celebration of the series. We see art and imagery from Wind Waker and Ocarina, and a lot of stuff from Link to the Past. Why not throw in a new Ganondorf for fun? Turns out he was ordering body around the whole time. You know what else is a loose celebration of the Zelda series, a spin-off of sorts? Hyrule Warriors. You know where that game falls on the timeline? It doesn't. It could have, but they chose not to add it. Even when they insisted on changing the placement of Link's Awakening, no effort was made to make Hyrule Warriors a canon entry in the series. But 4 Swords Adventures is. It's placed right after Twilight Princess. Why, oh why would it be there? It has so much more in common with the games in the Downfall timeline, but you know what? Ganondorf doesn't appear in the Downfall timeline. You know why? Because Ganondorf is underground being sealed by Rauru the entire fucking time. But you might say, this isn't the same Ganondorf you just told us, so why couldn't both Ganondorfs exist in the Downfall timeline? Because it is said that only one male is born to the Gerudo once every 100 years. Remember that weird little rule from Ocarina? They reference it in the scene where Ganondorf feigns fealty. Almost like they want us to think about it, because you know what? That rule is a lie. We know that because a male Gerudo has not been born for thousands of years by the time of Breath of the Wild. The whole Gerudo culture is romantically stunted because of the all-female population, so what's the deal? Well, what if when the rule was written, it was simply misunderstood? One male Gerudo every 100 years. So, one male Gerudo per generation, right? No Gerudo male would likely live beyond 100 years, so they just assumed it was based on the time period, and not the life force of the former Gerudo king. But they were wrong. There can only be one, and as long as Ganondorf clings to life, no male Gerudo will be born. So, Four Swords Adventures. A new male Gerudo, and they just happen to name him Ganondorf. He picks up a fork, and it turns him into a big pig. How could this be? Not the fork thing, the new Gerudo. Why, Four Swords Adventure could only feature a new male Gerudo to follow in Ganondorf's footsteps if the former Ganondorf had died. So yes, that means that Ganondorf does die at the end of Twilight Princess. And it's reasonable to assume that he dies in Wind Waker as well, because he turns to stone and the ocean falls on him. And now, Tears of the Kingdom. After corrupting the land with malice and gloom, shattering the Master Sword and filling the world with terrible monsters, Ganondorf, the rotten husk of a man stewing perpetually in his own hatred for all things weak and cowardly and peaceful, comes face to face with the hero of the wilds, recovered from their first encounter. After a vicious duel and a very rude fake-out with the health bar, Ganondorf gets desperate. He clutches at the stone he had embedded in his own forehead, rips it out and swallows it whole. His life, his goals, his sense of self meant nothing if he could not defeat this delightfully androgynous whelp that stood proudly before him. Ganondorf is no more. The spirit of the Demon King shatters and reforms into an immortal dragon, fueled by not only the stone, but the ancient curse of the god Demise coursing through his every cell. But that was to be his downfall. The Master Sword, the sword that seals the darkness, had spent a near eternity bathed in holy light, and after one last desperate battle, Link sinks the sword into the stone that gave Ganondorf this wretched power, and Ganondorf explodes. He explodes after he gave up his soul to become a dragon. It's a great finale, and I'm just gonna say, what a good game. And as Zelda miraculously returned from her draconic slumber remarks, the Demon King is gone. Now, if we were to indulge my theory and assert that this would be taking place at the end of the Downfall timeline, that means we have 1, 2, 3 timelines where Ganondorf is absolutely, without a doubt, fucking dead. All 3 timelines, we have conquered the Demon King. He is gone. That's why Four Swords Adventures is at the end of the child timeline. It was a clue. It was a beacon. It tells us even back around 2010 when it came out, when we face Ganondorf and we defeat him, we are not merely delaying an inevitable return. There's a difference between fighting Ganon and fighting Ganondorf. Ganon is a manifestation of evil, but Ganondorf is a man, and men, no matter how evil they are, men die. And that's why I like the timeline. I don't know if I'm right about any of this, but I don't see this idea being passed around much, so I wanted to share it. The timeline has always been the story of Ganondorf, and now that story has been told. Now, I'm no rube. I know there is no end to the Zelda series. It does no good to try and predict how the series will conclude, because that's not the kind of franchise this is. There will always be another game, but we can predict what might come next. Whether the next entry is still featuring the same incarnation of the characters, I have a feeling we're going to see a new villain. Ganondorf has nowhere left to hide. Well, except, so Hyrule Warriors isn't canon, but Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is, as far as I know. And in Age of Calamity, they do make a new timeline where musical egg helps prevent the calamity from happening, so Ganondorf is still down there beneath the castle and alive in that new timeline, so fuck this, never mind.